The man who called himself a priest was a tapestry of ink and scars. His head was shaved, revealing a scalp where serpents of black ink coiled and fought. They slithered down his neck, disappearing beneath the stark, white square of the Roman collar that sat incongruously against his throat. His knuckles, which rested on the polished wood of the witness stand, were a roadmap of his past. Each letter, crudely etched across the bone, spelled out a word of violence and despair from a life he claimed to have left behind. He was a paradox, a living contradiction that made the very air in the courtroom crackle with disbelief. Judge Arthur Thompson watched him from the elevated perch of the bench, a throne of mahogany and leather that amplified his presence until his ego filled every corner of the room. The courtroom itself was a monument to his authority. It was a sterile, cold space that smelled of bleach, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of human fear. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a monotonous, oppressive drone, casting a sickly yellow pallor on everyone below. It was a place designed to diminish, to make ordinary people feel small and powerless before the monolithic institution of the law, an institution that, in this room, was embodied entirely by the man with the gavel. Thompson's face was a florid testament to years of fine food, expensive whiskey, and the unchallenged exercise of power. He saw the world in simple, convenient categories, the orderly and the chaotic, the respectable and the degenerate, and the man on the stand, with his cage of tattoos and his disturbingly serene eyes, fell squarely and irrevocably into the latter. The clerical collar was not a sign of faith. It was an affront, a costume, a piece of audacious mockery aimed directly at him and the sanctity of his court. The man had been called as a character witness for a teenager named Leo, a boy with a ghost of a mustache and eyes that darted around the room like trapped birds. Leo was accused of robbery, and his young public defender, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, was putting up a desperate, sputtering defense. Calling this tattooed specter to the stand was her last, flailing attempt to cast a sliver of doubt. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," the prosecutor, a slick man named Davies whose ambition clung to him like cheap cologne, had said with a barely concealed smirk. The man's voice, when it came, was not the gravelly bark one might expect. It was calm, measured, and carried a strange resonance that seemed to quiet the shuffling and coughing in the gallery. "My name is Michael O'Connell. I am a Catholic priest." The silence that followed was a vacuum, deep and profound. Then it was shattered. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a chuckle of mild amusement. It was a volcanic eruption of scorn, a booming, unrestrained roar that bounced off the wood-paneled walls and slapped against the faces of everyone present. It was a laugh that gave permission, and a few jurors, along with the sycophantic prosecutor, joined in with nervous, tittering echoes. Father Michael did not flinch. He did not scowl or blush. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. He was a stone wall against which the judge's contempt splashed and dissipated. His calm was more infuriating to the judge than any outburst could have been. It was defiance in its purest form. "A priest?" Thompson boomed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. He leaned forward, his bulk straining the fabric of his black robe. "Son, I've seen my share of liars and charlatans in this courtroom, but you take the prize. A priest. That's rich." He pointed a thick, accusatory finger. "That is a costume, and you are in contempt of this court for wearing it. What gang are you with, boy? Do they require you to dress up like holy men before you go out and crack skulls?" The gallery murmured. The atmosphere shifted from tense to predatory. The man on the stand was no longer a witness. He was sport. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice still infuriatingly level. "I am the pastor of St. Jude's Parish on the east side. The boy on trial, Leo, is one of my parishioners. I am here to speak to his character." "You're here to make a mockery of my courtroom," Thompson thundered, his face darkening to a shade of plum. "St. Jude's, the patron saint of lost causes? How fitting. He sneered, the joke landing with a thud that pleased him immensely. I've had enough of this farce, mister. Davies, are you going to stand there and allow this thug in a dog collar to perjure himself by claiming to be a clergyman? Prosecutor Davies snapped to attention. Of course not, Your Honor. I object to this witness. His entire testimony is predicated on a fraudulent identity. Sarah Jenkins, the public defender, shot to her feet. She was young, barely 5 years out of law school, and the idealism hadn't been completely crushed out of her yet. Objection, Your Honor. My witness has stated his profession under oath. You have no basis to call him a fraud without evidence. Judge Thompson turned his wrathful gaze on her. Your basis, Miss Jenkins, is the man's face. My eyes. The common sense God gave a goose. Look at him. He looks like he crawled out of a prison sewer, not a seminary. He waved a dismissive hand. Your objection is overruled. In fact, I'm beginning to question your own judgment for bringing this spectacle into my court. He turned his attention back to Michael, his eyes glittering with a cruel idea. I'll give you one chance to come clean, boy. Take off that collar. Take it off right now, and I'll merely fine you for this ridiculous stunt. Refuse, and I'll have you charged with impersonating a clergyman and hold you in contempt. The demand hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was a test, a public breaking. To remove the collar would be to renounce his vows, to admit he was a fraud, to strip himself of his identity before this jeering crowd. Father Michael's gaze did not waver. He looked directly at the judge, not with anger, but with something that looked unnervingly like pity. With all due respect, Your Honor, he said, his voice a quiet declaration of war, I will not. This collar is a symbol of my vows to God. It is not a costume, and it is not for you to command me to remove it. The room went silent. A gasp rippled through the gallery. It was one thing to be defiant. It was another to so calmly and directly refuse a command from the man who was, in this room, a king. Thompson's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, contorted into a snarl of pure fury. The quiet, unyielding dignity of the man before him was an intolerable insult. It was a challenge to the very foundation of his power, which relied on fear and intimidation. This man, this tattooed enigma, showed neither. "Bailiff!" the judge roared, his voice cracking like a whip. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. Two burly men in uniforms, who had been standing impassively by the wall, straightened up. Take this man into custody. He is in contempt of court. The bailiffs hesitated for a fraction of a second, their eyes flicking from the apoplectic judge to the serene man on the stand. There was something about the man's stillness that gave them pause. But the judge's authority was absolute, his rage a tangible force. They began to move forward, their footsteps heavy on the linoleum floor. "You dare to stand in my courtroom," Thompson spat, his voice trembling with rage, "covered in the filth of the gutter, and lecture me on respect? I will teach you respect. You will sit in a holding cell until you rot, or until you are ready to beg this court for forgiveness." He looked down at the prosecutor. "Mr. Davies, I want him charged. Impersonating a clergyman, contempt of court, obstruction of justice. Throw the book at him. I want him to understand that the law is not a joke." Davies, seeing his opportunity to curry favor, nodded eagerly. "Yes, Your Honor. Right away, Your Honor." Sarah Jenkins stood frozen, a pillar of impotent horror. Her case was gone. Her witness was being arrested. She had not just failed her client, she had led this man who had come to help into a lion's den. She watched as the bailiffs reached Michael. He did not resist. He turned and placed his hands behind his back, a gesture of practiced submission that spoke of a past she could barely imagine. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was brutally loud in the silent room. As they led him away from the witness stand, past the jury box, past his young, terrified parishioner Leo, Father Michael's face remained a mask of tranquility. But his eyes were not empty. They were focused inward, drawing on a reservoir of strength forged in a crucible of suffering that Judge Thompson, in his cushioned life, could never comprehend. Sarah watched him go, and a fire ignited in her gut. It was a blaze of pure, righteous fury. She was a public defender. She was used to seeing injustice, to seeing the system chew up and spit out the poor and the marginalized. But this was different. This was not the indifferent grinding of bureaucratic gears. This was a personal, venomous act of cruelty, born from nothing more than prejudice and ego. It was a desecration. She looked at Judge Thompson, who was now preening on his bench, basking in the afterglow of his power display. He was lecturing the jury about the importance of order and decorum, his voice dripping with self-congratulation. In that moment, Sarah Jenkins made a decision. It was a risky, career-threatening decision, but it was the only one her conscience would allow. She looked down at her case file, at the intake form for her character witness. Next to Name, Michael O'Connell, there was a phone number for the parish office, and beneath it, in the Emergency Contact section, was another entry, written in Michael's own hand. Diocese Chancery Office, in case of pastoral emergency. She had thought it an odd thing to include at the time. Now it felt like a lifeline, a pastoral emergency. This, she thought with grim certainty, qualified. The judge called for a 15-minute recess before proceeding with the mockery of a trial. As the jury filed out and the room began to empty, Sarah grabbed her file and her worn leather briefcase and walked, not with a shuffle of defeat, but with a stride of newfound purpose, out into the hallway. The air outside the courtroom was cooler, less charged with malice. She found an empty alcove near a water fountain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her cell phone. This was insane. She could be disbarred. Thompson was a powerful, vindictive man. He had friends on every committee, in every office. Ruining a young public defender's career would be a trivial matter for him. But then she pictured Father Michael's face, the quiet dignity, the way he looked at the judge not with hate, but with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He had walked into that courtroom to do a good deed, to stand up for a lost boy, and he was being crucified for it. She owed him this. She owed it to whatever shred of justice she still believed in. She dialed the number for the Chancery. A crisp, professional voice answered. Archdiocese Chancery. How may I direct your call? Sarah took a deep breath, forcing her voice to be steady. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a public defender. I need to speak to the chancellor, or the bishop, or someone in authority. It is an emergency. The chancellor is in a meeting. If you'd like to leave a message— No, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising with an urgency that surprised even herself. You don't understand. A priest from your diocese, Father Michael O'Connell, has just been arrested. In a courtroom. He was arrested by a judge for being a priest. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The professional crispness in the voice dissolved, replaced by a note of stunned concern. Father O'Connell, arrested? Where? County Courthouse, Courtroom 4B. The judge's name is Arthur Thompson. He held him in contempt for refusing to remove his collar. He's being charged with impersonating a clergyman. It's a travesty. They're treating him like a criminal. Judge Arthur Thompson. The voice repeated, the name spoken with a new, hard edge. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. Miss Jenkins, are you still at the courthouse? Yes, in the hallway outside the courtroom. Do not leave, the voice commanded, now imbued with an authority that sent a shiver down her spine. Go back into that courtroom. Sit down. A representative of the archdiocese is on their way. Help is coming. The line went dead. Sarah stood in the alcove, her phone pressed to her ear, the dial tone buzzing. Help is coming. The words echoed in the empty hallway. She didn't know what kind of help to expect. A lawyer from the diocese, perhaps, someone to file a motion. But the tone in that voice, it promised something more. It promised a reckoning. Meanwhile, in the bowels of the courthouse, Father Michael sat on a cold, concrete bench in a holding cell. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale urine, and despair. It was a smell he knew well, a perfume from his former life. The iron bars were cold against his back. His hands were cuffed in front of him now, a small mercy from a bailiff who had looked at him with a flicker of unease, as if suddenly uncertain of his role in this drama. He closed his eyes, shutting out the grim surroundings, the graffiti on the walls, the distant shouts of other prisoners. He did not feel fear or anger. Those emotions were old ghosts, and he had learned long ago how to quiet them. Instead, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, the kind that only came in moments of total surrender. He began to pray, the words forming silently in his mind. He prayed not for his own release, but for Judge Thompson. He prayed for the man's hardened heart, for the pride that had blinded him, for the soul that was so starved of grace it could no longer recognize it in others. His mind drifted back, pulled by the currents of memory. He saw himself as a young man, not in a collar but in gang colors, his face a mask of rage and bravado. He felt the familiar, ugly thrill of a street fight, the crack of bone under his fist, the coppery taste of his own blood. He remembered the night it all ended, the flash of a rival's blade, the searing, white-hot pain in his side as his life poured out onto the grimy pavement of an alley. He remembered lying there, the world fading to a gray tunnel, and the face that appeared above him. It wasn't a paramedic or a police officer. It was an old priest, Father Thomas, his face a web of wrinkles, his eyes filled not with judgment, but with an impossible compassion. The old priest had knelt in the filth and the blood, taken Michael's hand, and begun to administer the last rites. "God's mercy is greater than our sins, my son," the old priest had whispered, his voice a balm on Michael's terrified soul. He had survived that night. And in the sterile quiet of the hospital ward, Father Thomas had visited him every day. He never preached. He just sat and listened. He listened to the torrent of poison and pain that poured out of Michael, the story of a life wasted on violence and hate. He had listened, and he had seen something underneath it all, a flicker of a soul that had not yet been extinguished. It was Father Thomas who had guided him, who had shown him that his strength, his loyalty, his warrior's spirit could be forged into something new. It was a long, brutal path, years in a monastery, scrubbing floors, digging graves, battling the demons of his past in the silence of his own cell. The other seminarians had kept their distance, whispering about the tattooed monster in their midst. But the bishop, a wise and discerning man, had seen what Father Thomas had seen. He had seen a shepherd, one who had been a wolf and knew how to protect the flock from other wolves. He remembered the day of his ordination, the weight of the vestments on his shoulders, the scent of incense and old stone in the cathedral. He remembered kneeling before the bishop, the man's ancient hands resting on his head, the words of consecration washing over him, sanctifying not just his soul, but his scars, his ink, his entire broken history. He had risen from his knees a new man, a priest forever, an instrument of the very mercy that had saved him. The collar was not a piece of cloth. It was the physical manifestation of that vow, that transformation. The cuffs on his wrists were just metal. They could not bind his spirit. The judge's insults were just noise. They could not touch the truth of who he was. He had faced down men with guns and knives for the sake of a single soul. A prideful judge in a black robe was nothing. A key scraped in the lock of the cell door, jolting him from his reverie. The same bailiff who had cuffed him stood there, his expression now one of profound discomfort. "On your feet," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "You're wanted back in the courtroom." Michael rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold concrete. He did not ask why. He simply obeyed, his calm unnerving the guard more than any protest could have. As they walked back through the labyrinthine corridors, Michael noticed a change. The courthouse staff, the clerks and officers they passed, stared at him. But the looks of derision were gone, replaced by expressions of awe, confusion, and a dawning, terrible respect. Something had happened. The air had changed. Sarah Jenkins had returned to her seat as instructed. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The courtroom was slowly refilling. Judge Thompson returned to the bench, his face still flushed with victory. He looked down at her, a cruel, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Well, Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, "are you ready to proceed with your, shall we say, diminished case? Or do you have any more colorful characters you'd like to call to the stand?" Sarah met his gaze, and, to her own astonishment, she did not look away. She did not shrink. She simply stared back at him, her expression unreadable. Her silence, her lack of fear, seemed to annoy him. He grunted and shuffled some papers. "Very well. Bailiff, bring in the defendant, and bring me the prisoner O'Connell. I want to see him when I sentence him for contempt." Leo was brought back to the defendant's table, his face ashen. Then Father Michael was led in, still in cuffs, and made to stand by the bailiff near the prosecution's table. He stood with his head bowed slightly, a portrait of humble endurance. The judge savored the sight, a general reviewing a captured enemy. He was about to begin a long, self-important speech to pour salt in the wound he had created, to cement his dominance for all to see. He never got the chance. At that exact moment, the great oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. They did not creak or slam. They opened with a silent, inexorable force as if pushed by a will of pure iron. Two figures stood silhouetted in the bright light of the hallway, their forms casting long, imposing shadows down the central aisle. The entire room turned to look. A hush fell, immediate and absolute. The judge paused, his mouth half open, an expression of annoyance flashing across his face at the interruption. The figures began to walk forward. Their steps were not hurried. They were measured, rhythmic, deliberate. The sound of hard leather soles on the tiled floor was the only sound in the vast, silent room. It was the sound of approaching judgment. As they moved out of the silhouette and into the jaundiced light of the courtroom, a collective gasp swept through the gallery. The first figure was a tall, austere man in his late 60s. He was dressed in a black cassock trimmed with brilliant, shocking crimson. A pectoral cross of ornate gold hung from a chain around his neck, flashing in the light. A crimson zucchetto, the skullcap of his office, sat on his head of thick, silver hair. His face was sharp, intelligent, and etched with lines of authority. It was a face known throughout the city, a face that appeared on television and in newspapers, a face that commanded respect from politicians and paupers alike. It was Cardinal Alistair Beaumont. Walking a half-step behind him was another man, a Monsignor, his own cassock a severe black, his face grim and set. They were not dressed for a casual visit. They were wearing the formal vestments of their office, the raiment of power and spiritual authority. They looked like princes of a heavenly kingdom who had descended into a grubby, mortal squabble. Out of a deep instinctual reflex, people began to rise. The gallery, the lawyers, the court reporter, even the battle-hardened bailiffs, one by one they got to their feet. It was a spontaneous, silent tribute to the gravity of the presence that had just entered the room. The only person who remained seated was Judge Arthur Thompson. He stared, his face a comical mask of confusion and irritation. He did not recognize the gravity of the situation. He only saw an interruption, an inexplicable breach of his courtroom's protocol. The Cardinal did not look at the judge. He did not acknowledge the standing crowd or the stunned silence. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room and found their target. They locked onto Father Michael, who had raised his head, his expression for the first time showing a flicker of surprise. Cardinal Beaumont walked down the aisle, his crimson-trimmed cassock flowing behind him like a royal train. He did not stop at the bar that separated the gallery from the court. He passed through the gate, which a bailiff scrambled to open for him, and walked directly toward the spot where Father Michael stood in his handcuffs. He stopped directly in front of him. The two bailiffs flanking Michael instinctively took a step back, as if repelled by an invisible force field. The cardinal looked at the steel cuffs on Michael's wrists. His gaze was cold and hard. Then he looked up at Michael's face, and his expression softened into one of profound concern and affection. He raised a hand, not to the cuffs, but to gently, reverently, place it on Michael's shoulder. "Michael?" The cardinal's voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent chamber. It was a voice accustomed to filling cathedrals, and it lost none of its power at a lower volume. "Are you all right, my son?" Father Michael managed a small, weary nod. "I am, Your Eminence. Thank you for coming. I would have walked here myself had I known sooner," the cardinal replied, his voice laced with a cold anger that was not directed at the priest before him. He gave Michael's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, a gesture of profound solidarity and protection. Only then did Cardinal Beaumont turn his attention to the man on the bench. He turned his body, slowly, deliberately, and fixed his icy gaze on the judge. For the first time, Judge Thompson seemed to understand that this was not a random interruption. The cardinal's eyes were not those of a visitor, they were the eyes of an executioner. "Judge Arthur Thompson," the cardinal said. He spoke the name as if it were a piece of filth he was forced to handle. The judge, who had been about to demand an explanation for this intrusion, felt the words lodge in his throat. "I am Alistair Cardinal Beaumont, Archbishop of this city," he announced, though every person in the room already knew who he was. "And I have come to collect my priest." The cardinal's voice, which had been quiet and personal when speaking to Michael, now rose, taking on the timbre of righteous thunder. "I was informed just 30 minutes ago of a grotesque parody of justice taking place in this room. I was told that one of my priests, a man who has given his life to God and to the service of the most vulnerable in this city, was arrested, in a courtroom, for the crime of wearing his collar." He took a step toward the bench, and Judge Thompson visibly shrank back in his oversized chair. "I see before me a man in handcuffs, a man I know to be holy, and I see a man in a robe, a man I now know to be a disgrace to his own sacred office." The judge's florid face began to pale, the blood draining from it as the cardinal's words struck him like physical blows. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. "You question this man's identity?" the cardinal thundered, his voice ringing with scorn. He gestured toward Michael. "You see his tattoos and you see a thug. I see them, and I see a testament to the boundless mercy of Almighty God. I see the story of a man who was lost and has been found. This is Father Michael O'Connell, and he is not just a priest. He is a hero." The cardinal began to pace before the bench, his voice a rolling indictment that held the entire room spellbound. "Let me tell you who you have humiliated today, Judge. Before he was Father Michael, he was Sergeant O'Connell of the United States Marine Corps, a decorated combat veteran who served 2 tours and was awarded the Navy Cross for pulling 3 wounded men from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. Does that fit your definition of a respectable man?" A murmur of shock went through the room. The bailiffs, both veterans themselves, looked at Michael with new, startled eyes. "When he returned from the war, he fell," the cardinal continued, his voice softening slightly, becoming the voice of a storyteller. "He fell into darkness, as many brave men do when they return from the hell of combat. He fell into a world of violence and despair. The tattoos you mock are the scars from that war, a war he fought right here on the streets of our city. But his story did not end there. He was saved. He was called by God to a new kind of service. He spent 8 years in seminary and in a monastery battling his demons and dedicating his life to penance and prayer. I was at his ordination. I laid my hands on his head myself. His collar is more earned than your robe, Judge. It was paid for with blood, with sacrifice, and with a courage you cannot possibly imagine." He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling accusatory finger at Thompson. "For the last 10 years, Father Michael has served as the pastor of St. Jude's, in the single most dangerous and impoverished parish in this archdiocese. He walks streets at night that the police are afraid to patrol in daytime. He has personally pulled more than 100 young men out of gangs. He has started a food pantry that feeds 300 families a day. He has opened a shelter for the homeless. He counsels drug addicts. He comforts the dying. He is, by any measure, a living saint. And you called him a thug in a dog collar." The Cardinal's voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "This man has stared down murderers without flinching. He has stood between armed gangs to broker peace. He has faced more evil in a single week than you will see in your entire coddled life. And you, in your arrogance and your prejudice, thought you could break him by mocking his appearance and threatening him with a night in jail." The judge's face was now a ghastly, pasty white. His jaw hung slack. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. He was utterly, completely dismantled. The authority had been stripped from him, layer by layer, until he was nothing but a small, terrified man in a black dress. "You have not merely insulted a good man," the Cardinal concluded, his voice swelling to a final, damning crescendo that shook the very windows. "You have defamed a holy office. You have obstructed the work of God. You have violated your oath, and you have brought shame upon this court and this city. Your judgment today is the one that is fraudulent." Silence. A thick, heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The Cardinal stood, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his eyes still blazing with holy fire. The Monsignor at his side stepped forward and, without a word, handed a thick file to the court clerk. The clerk, her hands trembling, accepted it. "That," the Monsignor said in a voice of cold formality, "is a formal complaint to the State's Commission on Judicial Conduct, demanding your immediate removal from the bench for gross misconduct, abuse of power, and religious persecution. It contains sworn affidavits from 3 city council members, the chief of police, and a United States congressman, all of whom count Father Michael as a personal friend and confessor. They were all more than happy to sign it." Judge Thompson made a small, choking sound. He looked at the file as if it were a venomous snake. His career, his reputation, his entire world was contained in that manila folder, and it was a death sentence. The Cardinal turned his back on the judge, a final, damning gesture of dismissal. He walked back to Father Michael and nodded to the nearest bailiff. "His cuffs. Remove them. Now." The bailiff, a large man with a military haircut, fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. "Yes, Your Eminence. Right away, Your Eminence." The cuffs clicked open and fell away. The bailiff looked at Father Michael, his face a mixture of awe and deep shame. "Father, I'm sorry." Michael simply nodded, accepting the apology with a quiet grace that seemed to shame the man even further. He rubbed his wrists not out of pain, but as if reacquainting himself with his own freedom. The prosecutor, Davies, was practically crawling over his own table in his haste to undo the damage. "Your Eminence, Your Honor, the people wish to move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against Father O'Connell, and all charges against the defendant, Leo Martinez, as well. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." Cardinal Beaumont gave Davies a look of such withering contempt that the man physically recoiled. "A misunderstanding," the Cardinal repeated softly, the word dripping with acid. "Yes, I believe there has been." Judge Thompson, finally finding a sliver of his voice, croaked, Court is adjourned." He slammed his gavel down, but the sound was weak, pathetic, a child's toy hammer. He half rose from his chair, then seemed to collapse back into it, a puppet with its strings cut. The Cardinal placed a protective arm around Father Michael's shoulders. "Let's go home, Michael," he said gently. The Monsignor flanked them on the other side, forming a phalanx of ecclesiastical power. Together, the three of them turned and began to walk out of the courtroom. The crowd in the gallery, which had been frozen in stunned silence, parted for them as if they were royalty. People looked at Father Michael with a reverence that bordered on worship. They saw him now not as a tattooed ex-con, but as the Cardinal had painted him. A soldier, a saint, a man of impossible strength and grace. Sarah Jenkins watched them go, tears of overwhelming relief and inspiration streaming down her face. She had made a phone call. She had lit a match. And a prince of the church had come and burned the whole corrupt system to the ground. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As he reached the courtroom doors, Father Michael paused. He turned and looked back, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. He saw Leo, the young boy he had come to defend, weeping with relief at the defense table. He saw Sarah Jenkins, her face alight with a renewed faith in justice. And finally, his eyes came to rest on the broken figure of Judge Arthur Thompson, slumped in his great chair, a king deposed in his own crumbling castle. There was no triumph in Father Michael's eyes. There was no gloating, no satisfaction. There was only a vast, profound, and devastating sadness. He did not say a word. He did not need to. His look was a sermon in itself. It spoke of forgiveness, but not of absolution. It said, "I will pray for your soul, but you must now live with the man you have shown yourself to be." Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the silence and the shame behind him. He stepped out into the light of the hallway, a free man, his collar a stark white beacon against the dark ink of his past, a symbol not of what he had been, but of the incredible power of what he had become. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The story exploded across the city. The priest and the judge became the headline on every news channel and front page. Reporters camped outside the courthouse and the archdiocese headquarters. The Commission on Judicial Conduct, under immense public and political pressure, fast-tracked its investigation. Within a week, Judge Arthur Thompson was suspended from the bench, pending a full hearing. But the hearing was a formality. More stories began to emerge. A floodgate of complaints opened by the Cardinal's public denunciation. Lawyers, defendants, and even former court staff came forward with their own accounts of Thompson's prejudice, his abusive temperament, his petty tyrannies. He was a bully who had finally picked a fight with an opponent who had an army at his back. The hearings were a public vivisection of his career. He was portrayed as a man drunk on his own minor power, a petty monarch ruling a fiefdom of fear. He was stripped of his judgeship, disbarred, and his portrait was quietly removed from the courthouse gallery of esteemed jurists. He faced a slew of civil lawsuits from past victims of his biased rulings. His fall from grace was absolute and total. He lost his prestige, his pension, his profession, and the respect of everyone he knew. His name became a cautionary tale, a byword for judicial hubris. In the wake of the scandal, systemic changes were implemented. The State Bar Association, in a partnership with the Archdiocese and other community faith leaders, created a new, mandatory training program for all sitting judges and court officers. It was a program focused on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and religious literacy. The Thompson Rule, as it was unofficially called, became a part of the Judicial Code of Conduct, a permanent reminder of the day a judge's prejudice was so spectacularly undone. Sarah Jenkins became an overnight hero in the legal community. Her brave phone call was lauded as an act of profound professional courage. She was inundated with job offers from prestigious civil rights firms and nonprofits. She eventually accepted a position with the Innocence Project, dedicating her career to fighting for those the system had unjustly condemned. She had found her calling in the crucible of courtroom 4B. And Father Michael? He vanished from the headlines as quickly as he had appeared. He gave no interviews. He posed for no photographs. He quietly returned to St. Jude's Parish, to the broken and the forgotten, to the world where he belonged. The sudden fame was a distraction, an uncomfortable spotlight on a man who preferred the shadows, where his work was most needed. His life returned to its familiar rhythm of early morning masses, long afternoons in the food pantry, and late nights walking his blighted, beloved streets. Several months passed. The seasons changed. The scandal faded into the city's memory. One cold autumn evening, as Father Michael was helping to lock up the parish hall after the nightly soup kitchen service, a figure emerged from the shadows of the street. The man was thin, dressed in an ill-fitting, cheap suit. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out. It took Michael a moment to recognize him. It was Arthur Thompson. He was no longer Judge Thompson. He was just a man, stripped of all his former glory. He looked lost, broken. He approached the priest hesitantly, like a supplicant approaching a shrine. "Father O'Connell," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper, a ghost of its former boom. I don't know why I'm here." Father Michael stopped what he was doing and turned to face him fully. He simply waited, his expression patient. "I lost everything," Thompson said, his voice cracking. "My job, my reputation, my friends. They took it all." He wasn't speaking with anger, but with a kind of dazed bewilderment. "And I deserved it. I see that now. I was a monster. What I did to you, what I said, it was unforgivable." Tears began to well in the former judge's eyes. "I came to apologize, to beg for your forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it." Father Michael listened to the confession, his head tilted slightly. He looked at this humbled, shattered man, and he felt no trace of triumph, only the familiar ache of compassion for a suffering soul. "An apology is a start, Arthur," Michael said, using his first name with a gentleness that seemed to stun the man. "Words are easy, but God is not interested in our words of regret. He is interested in our acts of repentance." Thompson looked confused. "What can I do? I have nothing left. I am nothing." Father Michael gestured back toward the parish hall, where a few volunteers were still scrubbing pots and sweeping floors. Beyond it lay the neighborhood, dark and teeming with need. "Redemption isn't found in a courtroom, Arthur. It's not found in begging for forgiveness. It's found in here." He pointed to his own heart, then swept his hand out to encompass the struggling parish around them. "It's found in service, in feeding the hungry, in clothing the naked, in seeing the face of God in the people you once despised." He looked directly into Thompson's eyes, his gaze both a challenge and an invitation. "You want forgiveness? Then earn it, not from me, from them." He nodded toward the dark streets. "Come back tomorrow. The food pantry opens at 9. We're always short-handed." He held the man's gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the rectory without another word. The next morning, as the first rays of dawn broke over the gritty rooftops of the east side, a man in a cheap, worn-out suit stood waiting by the door to the parish hall. When the volunteers arrived to open up, Arthur Thompson, the man who was once a judge, took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and quietly asked where he could find an apron. He spent the day unpacking crates of canned goods, his soft, uncalloused hands struggling with the work. He spent the next day and the day after that doing the same. He learned to look the people in the food line in the eye, to see their humanity, to offer them a small piece of bread and a quiet word of dignity. He never regained his fortune or his old life. But on the broken streets of the east side, in the shadow of St. Jude's Church, under the watchful, compassionate gaze of the tattooed priest he had once tried to destroy, Arthur Thompson slowly, painstakingly began the long, hard work of saving his own soul.